Desperate measures. The hidden crisis among Jehovah's Witnesses in Brazil. In the northeastern coastal city of João Pessoa, Brazil, where the Atlantic Ocean meets endless stretches of white sand beaches and the sun burns hot nearly every day of the year, something unusual is happening. It's not immediately visible to tourists enjoying their coconut water or locals heading to work in the morning heat. But for those who know where to look, the signs are everywhere. The blue literature carts with their colorful pamphlets about paradise on earth are still there on the corners, still positioned strategically near bus stops and shopping centers. But look closer. The same faces appear again and again. The volunteers seem older, more tired. And if you pay attention to the internal communications circulating among congregations in this city of nearly 1 million people, you'll discover something the organization doesn't want anyone to know. They're running out of believers willing to preach. A letter recently distributed to several congregations in João Pessoa by a circuit overseer has exposed what many suspected but few dared to say out loud. The organization is in crisis. Not the kind of crisis they acknowledge in their publications, where persecution and worldly opposition are framed as badges of honor. This is different. This is internal collapse disguised as opportunity. The letter, written with the careful language of corporate management dressed in spiritual terminology, makes an urgent plea. They need at least 300 new volunteers immediately to sustain their public witnessing program. 300. In a city where there are already established congregations with thousands of members, they cannot find enough people willing to stand next to a cart for a few hours a week. The tone of the letter is striking for anyone familiar with Watchtower communications. There's no triumphalism here, no declarations of Jehovah's unstoppable organization marching forward. Instead, there's barely concealed desperation. The overseer writes about extraordinary growth in the cart witnessing program, but anyone who has spent time inside the organization knows how to read between those carefully chosen words. When they talk about growth in programs rather than growth in people, when they celebrate increases in activity hours rather than baptisms, when they need to beg for volunteers to fill positions that once had waiting lists, they're not describing success. They're describing failure dressed in optimistic language. What makes this letter particularly revealing is what it admits without quite saying directly. The traditional door-to-door ministry, the activity that has defined Jehovah's Witnesses for more than a century, the work that separated them from other Christian denominations and became their most recognizable feature, is dying. The overseer explains that people are no longer home during the day. They're at work, at school, or they're simply out living their lives. The world has changed, he suggests, and the organization must adapt. So now the focus has shifted to public spaces. Beaches, parks, shopping districts, anywhere people congregate. The carts must go where the people are, because the people are no longer waiting at home for someone to knock on their door with good news about paradise. But this explanation, while technically true, conceals a deeper truth that many former witnesses recognize immediately. People aren't just unavailable, they're uninterested. And it's not only that the world has changed, it's that the witnesses themselves have changed. The door-to-door work always required a certain kind of courage and conviction. It meant facing rejection, enduring slammed doors and insults, spending hours in the hot sun or freezing cold, walking neighborhoods where dogs chased you and people yelled at you. It required genuine belief that you were saving lives, that the message was urgent, that Armageddon was imminent and every person you spoke to might be facing their final chance at survival. That belief system created a powerful motivation that could sustain people through the discomfort and humiliation of cold calling strangers about religion. But something has shifted in recent years. The sense of urgency has faded, even as the organization continues to insist that the end is near. People who grew up being told they would never finish high school in this system are now retiring. Generations have passed hearing the same warnings, seeing the same predictions quietly revised or forgotten. The cognitive dissonance has become harder to manage. And the internet has made it impossible to maintain the information control that once kept members isolated from contradictory evidence. Former members share their stories online. Investigative journalism exposes the organization's handling of child abuse cases. Academic research documents the psychological harm of shunning practices. Court documents reveal the financial structures and legal strategies. All of this information is readily available to anyone with a smartphone. The cart witnessing was supposed to be the solution to multiple problems at once. It eliminated the need to knock on doors and face direct rejection. It created a passive form of preaching that allowed members to fulfill their required hours without the same level of personal confrontation. It looked modern and professional, a kind of brand positioning that suggested the organization was adapting to contemporary culture. And it provided opportunities for members who couldn't or wouldn't do traditional door-to-door work to still participate in the ministry. In theory, it should have increased participation. The bar was lowered. The ask was smaller. Stand next to a cart and smile. Talk only to people who approach you. Count your time. Go home feeling like you've done your duty. But even this compromise has failed to generate the volunteers they need. The letter from João Pessoa makes this failure explicit. They've removed almost all the qualifications that once applied to this special service. In the early days of the CART program, only exemplary publishers were selected. You needed to have a certain standing in the congregation, a reputation for spiritual maturity and dedication. It was treated as a privilege, something to aspire to. Now, according to the letter, almost anyone can do it. The only requirements are that you're not under restrictions for some spiritual offense and you're not considered someone who causes problems. In other words, if you show up and you haven't been officially disciplined, you're qualified. They're not looking for the best anymore. They're looking for anyone willing to show up. Think about what this means for active witnesses reading that letter. Imagine you've spent years, maybe decades, faithfully going door to door every week. You've endured the embarrassment, the rejection, the physical exhaustion. You've sacrificed weekends and evenings and vacation days to preach. You've been told repeatedly that this work is the most important activity a Christian can perform, that lives depend on it, that Jehovah is watching and counting your hours. And now you're being told that the organization desperately needs people to stand next to a cart for a few hours, something significantly easier than what you've been doing, and they still can't find enough volunteers. What does that tell you about the state of faith in your congregation? What does it say about whether people really believe the end is coming? The implications extend far beyond João Pessoa. This is not an isolated incident, but a symptom of a global pattern. In congregation after congregation, country after country, the same story is repeating. The organization is aging. The young people are leaving in unprecedented numbers. Those who remain are less engaged, less willing to sacrifice, less convinced that the urgency is real. The pandemic accelerated this process dramatically. When Kingdom halls closed and meetings moved online, many witnesses experienced something unexpected: relief. They realized how exhausted they were, how much of their time and energy was consumed by organizational demands. Some never went back to in-person meetings. Others returned, but with less enthusiasm, less commitment. The spell had been broken. The organization's response to declining participation has been to create an illusion of vitality through carefully managed statistics. They count time differently now. They create new categories of service that inflate numbers. They celebrate increases in certain activities while quietly downplaying decreases in the metrics that actually matter, like baptisms and active publishers. They produce slick videos and build elaborate media centers and launch broadcasting networks, all designed to project an image of a thriving, modern, growing organization. But beneath the production values, the fundamental problem remains. People are voting with their feet. They're quietly fading away, reducing their participation, finding excuses to miss meetings, turning in bare minimum field service reports. For those who have left the organization, reading a letter like the one from João Pessoa produces a complex mixture of emotions. There's validation, certainly. After being told for so long that you were weak, that you lacked faith, that you were spiritually diseased for questioning or doubting, it's vindicating to see evidence that your concerns were justified. The problems weren't in your head. The organization really is struggling. The younger generation really is leaving. The old model really is collapsing. But there's also sadness, particularly for those who still have family and friends trapped inside. Because you know what it means to be an active witness right now, receiving these desperate pleas for more volunteers. It means more guilt, more pressure, more demands on your time when you're already exhausted. The guilt is perhaps the most insidious aspect of the system. Witnesses are taught from childhood that doing more is always possible and always necessary. If you're pioneering, you should be auxiliary pioneering. If you're auxiliary pioneering, you should be regular pioneering. If you're regular pioneering, you should be serving where the need is greater or working at Bethel. And if you're doing all of that, you should be doing it with more joy, more enthusiasm, more faith. Nothing is ever enough because Armageddon is always coming and lives are always at stake. So when the organization says they need 300 volunteers for cart witnessing, the implicit message to every individual witness is, why aren't you volunteering? What's more important than saving lives? Don't you have a few hours a week to give to Jehovah? This is how systems of control work. They don't function primarily through obvious coercion but through internalized obligation. The average witness hearing about this need for volunteers won't consciously think about whether they want to participate or whether they believe it's effective. They'll think about what their refusal to volunteer says about their spirituality. They'll worry about what others in the congregation will think. They'll feel the weight of all those meetings and publications reminding them that faith without works is dead, that true Christians must be zealous in the preaching work, that Jehovah rewards those who seek Him earnestly. And so they'll volunteer, even if they're tired, even if they're burned out, even if they've lost confidence in the message they're supposed to share. They'll stand next to that cart in the heat, smiling at passers-by who mostly ignore them, counting the minutes until they can go home and count their hours. The tragedy is that this crisis could have prompted genuine reflection and reform. An organization truly interested in the spiritual well-being of its members might have asked why people are losing interest in the preaching work. They might have questioned whether the model itself is flawed, whether the message resonates, whether the demands they place on members are sustainable. They might have considered whether an organization structured around constant activity and numerical growth has lost sight of whatever spiritual truths it once possessed. But that kind of introspection would require admitting error, acknowledging failure, allowing dissent. It would mean empowering individual members to think critically rather than simply obey. And that's something the organizational structure cannot tolerate without threatening its own existence. So instead, they do what they've always done. They reframe the problem as an opportunity. They create urgency where enthusiasm has faded. They lower the standards to increase participation numbers. They celebrate activity as though it were evidence of success. And they place the burden of failure on individual members while claiming credit for any positive developments. If the CART program fails to generate interest in the organization's message, that won't be because the message is unconvincing or the method is ineffective. It will be because members weren't zealous enough, weren't faithful enough, didn't give enough of their time and energy to make it work. For the 300 people who eventually volunteer in João Pessoa, whether motivated by genuine faith or by social pressure and guilt, the experience will likely follow a predictable pattern. At first, there might be some novelty to it, a sense of doing something meaningful. But as the weeks pass and the hours accumulate and conversation after conversation goes nowhere, the reality will set in. Most people walk past without making eye contact. Those who do stop are usually just being polite or looking for directions. Actual meaningful conversations are rare. Converting someone is rarer still. You'll stand there watching life happen around you, part of it but separate from it, representing an organization that you're increasingly unsure about while projecting confidence you don't feel. And you'll notice that it's often the same people at the carts, week after week. Despite the urgent call for 300 volunteers, despite the lowered requirements and the desperate appeals, the same small core of members will carry the burden. They'll be the ones who take the extra shifts when others don't show up. They'll be the ones praised for their faithfulness, even as they quietly resent being left to manage a failed program. They'll be the ones most likely to eventually burn out and leave, because the organization has a pattern of consuming its most dedicated members until they have nothing left to give. This is what the letter from João Pessoa really reveals, beneath the careful language and optimistic framing. It's a portrait of an organization in managed decline, trying desperately to maintain appearances while the foundation crumbles. The door-to-door preaching that once defined Jehovah's Witnesses is dead, replaced by a passive alternative that generates even less interest and engagement. The standards have been lowered so far that almost anyone can participate, but still they can't find volunteers. The younger generation is gone, the older generation is exhausted, and the middle generation is caught between obligation and doubt. When faith becomes routine, when urgency becomes chronic, when hope transforms into obligation, what remains isn't religion anymore. It's performance. It's going through motions that once had meaning but now exist primarily to sustain an institutional structure that depends on constant activity to justify its existence. The witnesses standing next to those carts in João Pessoa aren't really preaching. They're performing the role of preachers, maintaining the illusion that the work continues, that the organization is alive and growing, that Jehovah's purposes are moving forward. But illusions require enormous energy to maintain. And in the heat of a Brazilian summer, with the beaches full of people enjoying their lives and ignoring the literature carts, with congregations unable to fill volunteer slots despite desperate appeals, with the internet exposing contradictions and the next generation choosing different paths, the exhaustion is finally showing. The cracks are visible. And no amount of organizational desperation can hide what anyone paying attention can see. The system is dying, one empty cart at a time.